The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Welcome to our webinar on using Swagger to connect an Angular application to an existing backend. We'll be doing a Java EE backend today, but the principles discussed really should apply to most backend systems. Just an introduction. I'm Brian Fernandez. I love software development, and I've been doing it for decades. I'm a director here at Genuvitech, and I live in Pune, India. My primary role right now is helping make engineers like you write brilliant software. So what are we going to do today? We'll talk briefly about our company, Genuvitech, set up some basic concepts that would help us understand the technologies being used, and we'll spend some time looking at some code and using some utilities. We'll talk briefly to our products, which you could apply to your learnings from this webinar, but you're free to use other tooling as well. We'll have a live Q&A sections at the end, but there's also a chat panel. Some of you already asked questions. You can type in questions and we'll get to them if we can during the webinar itself. Next week, we'll be sending out a recording of this webinar, as well as links to relevant source code, documentation, and utilities. All right, so who is Genuvitech? So Genuvitech has been around for 2 decades. Ever since our first release of Eclipse plugins in 2001, we've been releasing new products almost every year. We've always been virtual, even before it became the in thing, and our employees are spread across over 10 countries now, covering practically all time zones. We have first-hand experience with how distributed teams work, and our goal has been to develop high-value, low-cost solutions for individuals as well as larger enterprises. Okay, so we are now going to talk about what we're aiming to achieve with this webinar. We'll go through a few concepts. So what are we here for? Let's say you have a Java EE application connected to a database with JPA. It's built with Maven, etc. And it exposes REST web services with JAX-RS. And maybe you want to develop a more modern Angular front end for this application. Maybe you have an app like Slack, and Slack exposes a public RESTful API, but you want to write a Java-based bot that interacts with it. So how would you go about this right now? You could manually read the documentation and write code in the language of your choice, or you can hope that the API provider has made an SDK available for the framework or language that you want to work with, and you could go ahead and use that SDK. Now, the first option, reading the documentation and writing code, does require a lot of manual work. The second option really depends on the API you're using, and it may not be available in the language of your choice. All right, so this is where the Swagger specification comes in. The specification allows you to thoroughly define and describe your APIs. It becomes essentially an API blueprint. It's language agnostic, so it doesn't really matter whether you're developing in C, Java, JavaScript, or TypeScript. And finally, the specification is something that can be easily understood both by humans and consumed by machines, consumed by software. How does it fit? How does Swagger fit into this particular picture we have going on? So Slack could simply provide a Swagger specification file as part or all of its public API documentation. You could do the same in your Java EE backend. You can actually generate the specification instead of creating it by hand. That's what we'll be doing. And once you have a specification, you can use a tool like Swagger UI to explore and test the services you've exposed. At the client side, which really could be your Angular site or maybe your Java bot, you can use code generation again. Again, we'll be doing some of this to generate both your models as well as code that would make calls to the exposed web services. All right, so in today's webinar, we're going to be showing you how to generate a Swagger specification for an existing Java EE backend. We're going to test this briefly with Swagger UI, and then we're going to build an Angular front end again, using a code generator to generate our models and some of the client-side service accessing code as well. Okay, so the Swagger specification, just a little bit of theory, is actually a bit of an outdated term. That's because in late 2015, the Open API initiative was formed under the Linux Foundation, to which the Swagger specification was donated. So version 2 of the Swagger specification became the Open API specification. And the Open API initiative has since worked with a very large community on creating version 3 of the specification, which was just released really in July this year. Personally, I'm used to still calling it the Swagger specification, so you might hear the two terms used interchangeably, but Swagger specification, Open API specification is basically now the same thing. The Open API specification, isn't really the only solution. It's the most popular one. Other alternatives were RAML and API Blueprint. Interestingly, RAML, which was, really was the next most popular alternative, also joined the Open API initiative in April this year, sort of ending the specification wars in a way. API Blueprint doesn't have that many users, but now seems to be the only big, moderately big independent player. All right, so to just give you some idea of how an Open API, of what an Open API specification file looks like, here's the Slack API in the Open API specification format. Notice the paths to this, particular channel's archive endpoint, as well as the different parameters that the API expects. So we're not going to go into the specification in detail. That's, it's definitely handy to know, but, we are going to be generating stuff and not writing any of this by hand. So what's Swagger now? Now, the Swagger specification is now officially the Open API specification. So what is Swagger? Swagger is basically a collection of developer tools. The Swagger editor, which you see here, allows you to develop your API in a top-down fashion, like design first, parses the definition as you type, and it creates the interface that you see on the right. This allows you to test your API immediately. As you're typing it, you can actually execute some of the calls to the endpoints. And this little bit on the right here is Swagger UI, and it's also available as a standalone app. In fact, we'll be using that shortly. Swagger Code Gen, again, something we'll be talking about. We'll take a Swagger specification file and generate code from it. This is going to generate both your model as well as the scaffolding code for your implementation, both client and server side, really. And it supports dozens of languages. CodeGen doesn't yet support version 3 of the spec, since that was just released, but support for version 3 is coming shortly. I just wanted to mention that. We'll be using version 2 of the spec in the webinar today. Now, typically, you can use all these tools independently, either online, or you can download and use them. You can use them offline too. But if you're looking for an integrated experience, Swagger Hub is where you will find that. It's by SmartBear software. All right, so let's move before we go into the code walkthrough. Let's move into a quick poll. The first one is, what backend tech do you use? And if you can just take a moment to answer the questions on your screen, let us know whether you use Java EE, Node, PHP, or other. And if it really is other, would be happy to know what you are using. You could leave a message in the question or comment area. All right, I can see 67% of people have voted so far. Let's leave it open for a few seconds more. Okay, so I've got a fair number of users, fair number of results. Just going to share the results right now. And you can see, as I can see, most of you are using Java EE. The next most popular, though not not really that high, is Node.js, and that's pretty cool. Java EE is really what we'll be talking about in this webinar anyway. All right, let's move on. Okay, let's actually start a little bit of our code walkthrough. So we have two parts to our walkthrough today. Part one is about generating a Swagger specification for an existing Java EE app. And part two is about creating an Angular frontend. In part one, what we're doing right now is we'll add a few libraries to our Java EE project. We'll add annotations to existing code. We'll add specification generation code, and then we'll deploy the app to get our Swagger specification file. We're going to use Swagger UI after that to explore the service of it. So remember, we'll be sharing links as well as the projects you used in this demo, so you don't have to worry about taking any notes or missing some screencasts. All right, so this is our Java EE application. It's a Maven project, and what we're going to do is just add some Swagger dependencies that you can see here to the POM file. So these are libraries that basically allow us to use the Swagger API, interact with JAX-RS, and allows us to use Swagger annotations, which we'll be seeing shortly in our code. And it includes a library that will generate the Swagger specification, the JSON file for us. So as I mentioned earlier, this is already a JAX-RS application. And you notice for example, the path attribute, the path annotation here, and say the consumes annotation right about here. These are already JAX-RS annotations that talk about the path at which the service is going to be available, and what input this particular endpoint requires. So this was already there. I didn't really make these changes as part of this demo. Now the API annotation that we've added over here, this is a Swagger annotation. It marks this class as one of the APIs to be exposed by the Swagger generator. I won't go through all the classes, but you can see that all the endpoints here in this little REST package over on the left have actually had the API annotation added to them, and they mark them as classes we want exposed in the specification file. Now this is really the root of our REST application. We've just added a little bit of boilerplate code that will generate the Swagger JSON file, the Swagger specification. Notice specifically on line 25 here, we've asked this code or this tool, this library to scan this particular package to look for classes that were annotated with API and are exposing REST web services. You notice that we've said here that we want the specification version 2 file generated, and the rest of the code here is really just pretty printing, scanning, etc. So nothing really important over here. So we deploy this application. This particular thing was deployed to a Wildfly web server, and basically start the server. And thanks to the annotations and the generation code that you just saw, we get a Swagger specification file. Note the URL. This is basically something running on my local machine. This is the web context root, and this was the path that we specified, just with the Swagger, the JSON at the end, and this entire specification file, really, this is the parsed version of that, was generated for me. So we didn't do anything. It wasn't Swagger before, and because of the annotations that we added, we now get this lovely specification file. You can see more clearly here, the base, the host, the base path at which the services are available, and some of the code, some of the actual, say, REST endpoints are defined more clearly here under this paths element. You can see the get category endpoint along with the parameters that it expects. All right, so I mentioned Swagger UI earlier, and for simplicity, all I've done is I've downloaded Swagger UI just from the GitHub repository, extracted it into my Java EE application. So this was a Java EE application, created a new folder, extracted Swagger UI into it. Don't have to compile anything, don't have to generate anything. It's just really a static app that you could run separately Also, you just now, if you are running it externally, you'd need to have the right cross-site scripting settings. We're not going to get into that over here. Probably all familiar with it anyway. Now, once we've loaded up Swagger UI, notice here's the URL. This is my browser. I've loaded Swagger UI here, and here I've specified the same URL that we were looking at earlier to the specification JSON. So Swagger UI has parsed it, and it has created this exploratory UI dynamically, really, for us. So this is really the category endpoint and a few methods, services that are available at that particular path. If I expand the categories path, this is deeper into that particular endpoint, and you can see it allows you to specify the same parameters we saw earlier, the start, category, and max. Now, if I go ahead and click execute, that particular command will be fired off, and the query is sent to the Java EE application that you have running. So it's sent to that. You saw the host earlier, you saw the base URL. The query is actually sent to those same locations, and this is the response. So I asked for application JSON response, and you can see a number of categories returned. And again, remember, this is in Swagger UI, and a few response header details are also available before. So using Swagger UI, you can explore the services as exposed by a Swagger specification file. And depending on how you defined it, now we did a rather simple job, just added a few annotations. This can actually be different from the JAX-RS web services that you're exposing. So you can make some changes in there. Now, this is not, Swagger UI is not just limited to using, don't have to use it with your own applications. You could use it with a third-party site. They could expose their specification file. You could point Swagger UI to that, and you can explore and test their web services without actually writing any code. So that's really a huge benefit that Swagger UI gives you. All right, so we used only the API annotation. I'd just like to talk to a few different annotations that you can also use in your code. So the API annotation was enough to really just have the class scanned and make sure it's present in the specification. Now, if you wanted to add more details to the generated specification, let's look at some of these other annotations. So when it comes to each operation or each endpoint, the API operation and the API parameter, API param annotations allowed you, they allow you to specify, to provide really some documentation specifying, you can specify what the response class will be, more specifically, or perhaps you can even specify whether a parameter is optional or not. Now, if you're returning an HTTP code, you can even provide a more detailed message with that code. So if you're looking for a category or if you're looking for a product and it's not found, instead of when 404 is returned, instead of it saying, resource not found, it could say pet not found or product not found. Now, the authorization annotation is actually possible both at the top API level and for individual endpoints will really allow you to specify what authorization scheme or something else applies to either the entire resource or the particular operation that it is annotating. So you can do individual, you can specify individual authorization requirements for each endpoint if you so desire. Now, on the model front, if you want, the Swagger creates a model through code introspection. We add a few annotations, it scans it, and it scans your code and creates a model for you. That's basically the default way in which it would work. Now, if you want to modify that model, if you want to manipulate it, you can use the API model, the API model property annotations. Again, this can be used to provide further documentation. You can create composite models, or you can even specify allowable values for a property. Or, as I said earlier, say you don't want to expose some properties. They are defined in your JAX-RS web service, but you don't want to expose them to Swagger. You can also use some of these properties some of these annotations to hide some things. There's also Swagger definition and a whole host of other annotations that will basically allow you to specify everything from contact details to license information, and this actually makes it to your specification. Would not normally if you just add the API annotation. All right, so let's move on to our next poll. What front-end technology you use? So again, take a minute to answer. Choose between Angular, React, Vue, or basically a Java EE-based front-end. Could be JSF or struts. And again, your comments would be appreciated if it is something else. Okay, we just have about 50% of the votes in. I'll just give it a minute. Okay, I guess that's we have a fair number of people who have voted, and let me just share those results. Okay, so again, great for this webinar. Most of you are using Angular already. That's very cool, and the rest of you are using JSF and struts. Well, Java EE, and that's pretty cool. We'll actually show you how you can move some of that to a nice Angular-based front end. Okay, let's get back to the presentation. Okay, so part two. What we're going to do right now is build, well, we're going to build parts of the Angular front end. We're going to create a new Angular project, generate a model and client code into this project, briefly walk through the code, show you what's generated, and finally we'll use this code in some Angular components to see what it looks like in a finished app. So this is pretty straightforward. With our Angular tooling, you get to select your versions of the Angular CLI. Our projects are all CLI based, Node, Node and NPM, and the tooling will download these for you. You don't really have to have these installed on your system. Project creation can take a little while, depending on whether you had that version of Node or NPM already, or whether we had to download it. And the creation process even goes on to install Node dependencies, download and install Node dependencies, really into your application. So this is what really a finished project creation process looks like. Let's go on to the next most important point, really, the code generation using Swagger Code Gen. So Swagger Code Gen is really a standalone Java application that's going to, in this case, that we're using to generate TypeScript code that's specific to Angular 2. We've just basically download Swagger Code Gen from their Maven repository. There's a GitHub URL. I mean, there's a GitHub repository. Tells you how to download this as a standalone app, and you can look at the exact command that we've used. Really straightforward to generate some code for us. So I've created a REST folder within the project that was just created, and I'm executing Swagger Code Gen in there. You can see the command here, and a key item to note is that we are pointing to exactly that same specification file that was generated automatically for us in the previous step. So, not specifying a new file, not doing something custom, it's what we already got automatically in the previous step that I'm using here, and it's generated a number of these files for us. Let's take a look at key bits of the generated code. So we have a folder here, the REST folder, and inside that you'll find an API and a model folder. There are some utility files as well. We won't be going into those. So remember we spoke about models being created through introspection just now, and these really are those models representing your resources now as standard TypeScript code. We can see that you can have a look at the category model here and the customer model on your screen, and you notice how some of the fields over here are even marked as optional. Enums are being used. There's an enum generated and used, and there are even references here to other interfaces in your model. So there's a pretty thorough and efficient generation job. None of this code was edited by me, was all generated by Swagger Code Gen. Let's move on now to look at some of the API classes that were generated, in this case, for the category resource. So you look at the find by ID method here, a more detailed call out on this side, and it takes an ID parameter, a numerical parameter. And as you can see in the TypeScript code here, there's already some validation again generated for us that before that would validate your request before it's actually sent to the server. And this validation really is based on details available in your specification. A detailed request is then created. It's the get HTTP verb, headers, etc. And finally, a request is fired off to the server at this path. If you look at the path, again, uses base path categories and uses the ID as part of that path. So now if you come back over to this side, you can see that the response is handled by an RxJS observable. So your site isn't, your app isn't going to hang until a response is available. That's all handled by observables and RxJS. Okay, so we've looked at both the model and some of the generated code. The API, the client-side code. And let's look at how you can use some of this in an actual Angular application in a component. So we're going to use our component wizard to create a category list component. Again, this uses the Angular CLI and just generates a bit of boilerplate code for you. Again, what the CLI specifies. Now, what you can see here, we've modified this, of course, is a pretty basic component that on load or on initialization fetches the entire category list. Observe that it does this using the category API class. And the list of categories that you obtain is actually added to this categories array. Again, that's the generated category model. So again, nice use of generated code, or of course, key use of generated code. And on the right is a pretty simple Angular template, really bare bones. And what it essentially does is iterate over the categories array that is obtained here and print a list of categories. I'll move on to at least just one more component. The product list component is pretty straightforward, a little more complicated, but it too uses the generated model, product class or the product interface, the generated client code, and it gets a list of, using a similar technique, gets a list of products and uses a filter here to get those only corresponding to a particular category, the one that we're interested in. Okay, so now once you add a bit of styling to your Angular app, here we use the Bootstrap theme. This is what your app looks like. There's certainly more code that goes into creating a front end like this, but essentially you saw the most important parts, accessing the service from your existing backend, and we did most of the heavy lifting with generated code. I'd like to mention that in the last couple of months, we did present a more detailed webinar on using Angular IDE to actually create that front end, which goes deeper into the creation of that app, or of this particular app. So if you're interested, you can look up that webinar. Recording is available as well. All right, so what we did here was generate a front end using one of our own specification files. If you wanted to say develop a client for a public service, where do you get the specifications? So more organizations are embracing OpenAPI. So in some cases, you should be able to download the specifications from a developer site. There are also people, though, who are developing or curating specification files. Like I'd like to mention here, Kin Lane. If you go to his API stack GitHub repository, you'll find specifications for over 150 APIs. This is a Slack one here, a number of specification files available. And he's covered all sorts of APIs ranging from Amazon really to YouTube. Okay, I mentioned OpenAPI 3 was recently released, and I thought it's a good time to talk about, just highlight a few differences in the spec. The best part is, with the techniques that you learned here today, you don't really need to worry about a new version of the spec. You just use the updated versions of the tools, generate version 3 of the spec in your Java EE application, use the updated code gen when it is finally available, should be shortly, to generate code with that version, from that version of the spec. So nothing to worry about, but just going through a few highlights. In version 2, you saw the host and you saw the base path. In version 3, really URLs are anywhere. You can specify them individually for even individual endpoints can have drastically different URLs. Components are a more formal way of specifying reusable objects as opposed to these 3 definitions, parameters, and responses that we have that we had in the older version. And there are lots of components comprising everything from responses to parameters and links. Request formats, response formats have been made more flexible. And I'd like to highlight linking, which is a new feature allowing you in a way to specify the next steps for a particular response. So say you asked for the first 100 products in your catalog. What next? You want to get the next 100, right? And that's where linking can be used in the specification to give users a clue about interesting endpoints where they could, which they could go to really to get more information. So maybe you received a list of products or a product with a category ID. Now you want to get more information in the category. What do? You look at the link and ask your client to go to there to get more information. There are some security changes as well, but we won't go into that here. So now let's move on very briefly to some dev tooling that will help you with developing apps like this. So if you're developing modern web applications, you can use Angular IDE or Webclipse to develop, starting with just JavaScript, or like we saw today, an advanced Angular application with TypeScript. You could even build backends with Node.js. And I'd like to mention we have the entire application lifecycle covered. You saw product creation. We've got syntax highlighting, content assist, validation, and we even do the deployment and debugging for you. Everything from within the IDE. If we move on, as far as Java EE is concerned, all these hardcore Java EE capabilities allow you to deploy to multiple application servers. You can work with Spring, manage your build with Maven, connect to databases with JPA, etc. So we got you covered no matter what you want to do with Java EE. That is in MyEclipse. And MyEclipse, of course, includes all the modern web development capabilities we just talked about in the previous slide. So it's not just Java EE, it's Java EE and all the modern web stuff as well. When it comes to power-ups, we've got Code Live and Live Preview. So Live Preview would allow you to see changes that you make in your Java EE application without saving the file, without redeployment. Just make the change and you'd see it in the browser immediately. So much faster on that front. As far as Angular apps are concerned, it allows you to quickly locate components back in your IDE when you're browsing an app in the browser. You've already seen the Terminal Plus. That's what I use to generate code. It's a custom bash environment. Even on Windows, gives you custom versions of Node and NPM. And for sharing, we have a Slack integration tool that allows you to quickly share snippets of code. Just last month, we released DevStyle, and this gives you an enhanced startup experience, a breadcrumb, you can see a breadcrumb toolbar, and an unintrusive inline search. Most screenshots now that you've seen in the prior slides were with a darkest dark theme, but with DevStyle, we've introduced other colors as well, other dark themes, and there are even light themes like this light gray one that you see here. Okay, so how do you get started using these tools? All our products allow you to try for free before you buy, so you don't hesitate to just download them and give them a spin. MyEclipse allows you to use it free for 30 days, while Webclipse and Angular IDE allow 8 free days of use per month. DevStyle is totally free. Now, if you're using some of our tools and you need additional evaluation time, just write to us and let us know. Now, if you want a standalone IDE experience, you would get MyEclipse or Angular IDE based on what you're developing. But if you already have an Eclipse environment that you're happy with, when you want to add some of these modern web capabilities to it, you can get Webclipse. If you're already a large team, we have a product called Secure Delivery Center, which can be used to manage your team's IDEs, plugins, configurations, workspace settings, etc., all from a nice central location, giving you a uniform development experience across your team. And we'd finally like to mention an upcoming offering, Code Together, which really is a fantastic pair programming solution that we have in the works, great for remote teams, and it's currently open for private beta. All right, with that, we come to the end of our webinar. The Swagger tooling that we've used, as well as the projects used in our demonstration, are really referenced on this slide. And I'm going to leave that up while I look for any questions that are still left unanswered.
We do have a couple good questions, so if you want, I can give you them in interesting order. So the last one was about the generation of a component. So does the Swagger gen generate just TypeScript, or does it also generate the Angular component that we saw in the demo?
So good question, and it generates just the TypeScript that I showed you. So I showed you the model and the client code. The component was generated in bits by Angular ID, and then we added some code into it, because there's no telling really what you want to do and how you want to use that particular web service. So component by us, the other stuff by Swagger Code Gen.
Perfect. Then we actually had a few questions regarding using Swagger UI. So if you don't mind, just briefly describe the process by which somebody would add Swagger UI to their existing Java EE app.
Sure. Let me see if I can just dial this back to that slide as well. Oh yeah. So Swagger UI, if you go to the website, you can either use the app live. So they have Swagger UI deployed. It basically would give you an interface like this, and you could type in here. That this is of course assuming your specification was accessible online. You could type in the specification URL and use it directly to explore your API. Now, if it's something internal, you would download that zip file, extract it either as part of your app, which I've done here, and then it's deployed with my app. You can see that it's part of my deployed application. Or you could just double-click the index.html file and have it open in a browser. It's a standalone app. As I said, there's no generation, there's no PHP or something else going on behind the scenes. It'll open up the same kind of UI for you. Type in the path, and well, Bob's your uncle. You get this nice, pretty UI, and you can explore your app from there. As I mentioned, especially when dealing, there's a request coming in from your local machine to an app that's running at a different domain, so to speak, like localhost as opposed to a file-based URL. The browser itself will prevent that request from going through unless you have the right CORS settings. So just look up CORS, and the settings are pretty easy to make for Java EE applications. Once you make those settings, Swagger UI will work rather simply.
Great. Another question. I heard that Swagger can create Java classes automatically from documentation, like from WSDL and XSD. Is it possible?
That's an interesting one. I'm not aware of Swagger CodeGen being able to work on anything other than the Swagger specification. So it can generate Java code. So of course we generated TypeScript here, generates Java, C. I forgot to create a list actually of all the languages that it can generate, but I don't think it will work off a WSDL or a schema file. I may be mistaken, but right off, I don't think so.
The IDE world.
Great. Sorry, I was just trying to share the link, a request to get the link to that previous webinar you alluded to. So I was just trying to pull that up here as well. So I'll share that link shortly as well. I believe that's it for questions. There's a few that were answers, so just making sure we didn't miss anything. Okay, I think we got it covered. Thank you so much, Brian.
All right.
And
Thank you, everyone.
I'll share that. We'll email, as part of emailing after the webinar, we'll send in that link to the previous webinar as well in that email for those who are interested.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.